the whole system is built around saying we have found something new that's going to be better. And so it gets called something new. And in order to be reviewed as new, it has to belittle that which came before, which creates a negative valence around the information and experience that in fact was gained before.
Welcome to the Case for Conservation podcast, where we explore biodiversity conservation and the environment more broadly and interrogate conventional wisdom for the sake of a more robust case for conservation. I'm your host, Andre Mado. Conservation competes with a variety of other societal priorities and interests for funding and for attention. As a result, conservation projects, programs, and even broader concepts are frequently packaged in ways that prioritize grabbing attention. But promoting or marketing conservation initiatives in this way carries certain risks. Among them is the risk of being short-lived and without a real basis in the substance of the actual initiative. In other words, a fad. Another is the risk of losing what's already been learned, especially when initiatives are repackaged under a new buzzword. Kent Redford is the principal at Archipelago Consulting and previously director of the Wildlife Conservation Society Institute in New York. In 2013, Kent published a paper in the journal Conservation Biology to flag his concerns about conservation fads. I called him up to revisit this topic because it relates quite closely to my increasing concern about conservation buzzwords. I began by asking Kent for the basics around what's meant by calling something a conservation fad.
So the concept of fads is, of course, something most people have experienced through popular culture. So it's not a new concept to people. The application within conservation is one that picks up on a phenomenon in which an operating procedure or a discipline in an area of trying to do conservation all of a sudden decides that it doesn't like what it's been doing and that there's something brand new with a new name that would be much better than what has been going on. And therefore, what has been going on is retooled, often quite rapidly, to take on whatever this new fad happens to be.
Mhm.
And of particular concern is not that there is a new idea, but that the old idea is dropped almost completely, as is anything that was learned from that original idea.
Do you think it's usually the case that the idea is lost or changed, or is it usually more of a semantic issue? That kind of gets immediately into my personal interest in buzzwords, where I find that there are plenty of terms which come up and everybody seems to kind of gather around them and treat them as if they're something completely new, but they seem to really just be a repackaging of what's already gone before. And I guess that maybe you lose more than just the branding, just the naming, because sometimes the processes and the projects behind the previous name might be lost. But do you think it is much more than just the name?
I would say that I think a buzzword is a stem that has roots. That is, if there's no action on a buzzword, then it simply buzzes until it's tired and then disappears. But if a buzzword has roots that take root, then there's action which comes from the application of that term. And it stops becoming a buzzword because it's then put into implementation and people resist calling it a buzzword. And they won't call it a fad until the next new idea has come along and has been adopted, probably initially as a buzzword, and then with roots becomes a fad.
Hmm. Probably a good idea to think about some examples here. Are there some which are currently popular that sort of come to mind, and maybe others that have been popular that have faded from view already?
Fads we're talking about?
Fads, yeah, yeah. We'll try and
Yeah,
stick to fads. I'm sure I'll be back with buzzwords later.
sure. And so I've been in the conservation and conservation implementation business for 40 years now. So I have seen most clearly, I think, and well documented is the ICDPs, the Integrated Conservation and Development Programs, which all of a sudden came upon the field and became the only thing to do with a lot of money going towards them, which nobody talks about anymore. They're just gone. Um,
Is this an American thing in particular or more global?
no, it's global because the World Bank took it up and put extensive funding into integrated conservation development programs. I mean, South Africa was one of the recipients of this, and the fact that you don't know that is proof that
Hmm.
it came, it flourished, and then it disappeared again. Then there have been a set of fads which did not have particular capitalized names associated with them, but which were nonetheless fads. So, for example, I think that poverty alleviation by conservation action was one that didn't ever get itself a name, but it was there, was what everybody wanted to do, and now nobody talks about it.
Hmm. I just can't help thinking that a lot of these things have just been repackaged, though. I mean, the essence of what was contained within integrated conservation management programs, if I've got the name right, and the poverty alleviation angle that you spoke about now, do you think the good work that was being done has been completely lost, or is it just being done under a different name?
No, I don't think so. I don't think that what has been learned from those is all gone, but I think the funding streams that focused on that have gone. And so the packaging of that idea in a coherent whole that was viewed as discrete from other sorts of things has disappeared. And it's slumped, or if you don't like that verb, it has composted into good practice. And so in a case like that, I think you have a you have a fad which has had some lasting benefit, but which as a coherent single entity has disappeared.
Hmm.
And I will give you an example, and again from my own life. So in the mid to late 1990s, there was a big push on sustainable use of rainforests, particularly Amazonian rainforests. And there was the US based ice cream manufacturer Ben and Jerry's created this rainforest crunch. So we were going to save the rainforest by selling sustainable products, be they Brazil nuts or hevia, latex rubber, natural rubber. And that has largely gone away. And I was invited to a meeting in Manaus in the Brazilian Amazon earlier this year. The meeting had 40 some people in it, most of whom were probably under 40. And they were gathered to figure out ways to make sustainable plant proteins from the Amazon forest as a way to save it. And I asked how many of them were familiar with this work that had been done in the 1990s. They were maybe five, maybe seven hands that were raised out of 40.
Hmm.
So that whole effort, which was the focus, there was a Royal Geographic Society meeting in London. Everybody stood up and made announcements. There were books published. I wrote on it, everything. It's gone to this generation. They have no cognizance of that. And that is the genesis for writing the paper that we wrote, not the particular meeting, but that fact that these people are using the same strategy as was used in the 90s without knowing what had been learned from what went on 30 years earlier.
Just a huge waste of resources.
A huge waste of resources. And, I was the oldest person there, or next to oldest person there. And, in my final remarks, I said to them, I have come to understand that conservation is like a relay race. And And I carry the baton for only so long, and I have to then pass it on to the next person. And I have a responsibility to try to place that baton carefully into the hands of the next runner. But the next runner has the responsibility to receive that baton. And you have a responsibility to learn what went on in the 1990s as you proceed further. Or else we're not running. I'm dropping the baton and you're picking it up and then running, and we will have lost the race if we keep doing it.
Hmm. There just seems to be so little questioning of the fact that this has been done before. There's some kind of loss of institutional knowledge there, and I don't quite understand well, first of all, what the mechanism is, like why people want to do that, why there's this desire to create new fads and not to just go with what was already working, and then also just why they're not questioning things a little bit more and sort of looking back because the literature is all there, right? I mean, most of the stuff has been written up in some form or another, so it's there to find if you want to find it.
In my experience, much of what has been done is not written about. And much of what has been written about adopts an approach that is heavily biased by whatever the current fads in the academia are, and
Right.
particularly focusing on controversies because journals love controversies the way middle school children love fights.
Mm.
So you yell, fight, 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 and everybody comes rushing over. And so if I want to guarantee to get an article written, I will object to what somebody else has done. So it is not true that you can learn simply by reading the literature. It is an important guide, but what you really need to do is go pay your dues by contacting and talking to people who have been in the field, whatever you're choosing to do for a while, and asking them.
Hmm.
But more directly to your point, funders don't want to fund the same old thing. So if I write a grant proposal that says, for the last 11 years, I have been working on poverty and protected areas, I would like 5 more years of funding to continue my work. The chances are probably zero that I'll get that. So what if I want to do that, but I don't think I can get money by calling it that? I need to call it something else. And the funders are as susceptible to fads, if not more so, than practitioners. And to not understand that there's a culture around fadism within the donor community is to miss completely. They're not omniscient people, entities sitting there saying that's the best idea.
Mm.
They compete with each other. They have the sources of their money to which they're accountable. They have trustees, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole system is built around saying we have found something new that's going to be better. And so it gets called something new. And in order to be reviewed as new, it has to belittle that which came before, which creates a negative valence around the information and experience that in fact was gained before. And so it takes the wise practitioner to understand that there's a gamesmanship going on and that they can get the money, but still can learn from a lot of the work that has generated important lessons that has happened before they start.
Hmm. Do you think it also happens sometimes that, especially more experienced conservationists will repackage something knowingly? So they're continuing the same kind of work, but precisely for the reasons that you just outlined, they're repackaging it, but they're kind of carrying on with the same things.
So if those were the only things going on, then I would be less worried about it. But take my example from the Brazilian meeting. You have entry and departure from the field going on simultaneously. So if you don't have people whose experience bridges this change in name, then you lose that. And if there's a lag time, as this Amazon example shows, a lag of decades, it further exacerbates this. You also have the culture of fundraisers within organizations. So it's often not the practitioners themselves who are the final arbiters of the grant proposal. you have the grant writers who are
Mhm.
responsible only for raising money. So they're not interested in many ways in the truth of it. The truth is that it got the money or it didn't.
Yeah.
You see that I have colleagues who have had grant proposals returned by the fundraising departments because of their use of terms like diversity. So you have the scrubbing of what is known by practitioners, by those who need to raise the money to respond to existing perceptions about, probably in this case more than perceptions, the fact that this external political social environment is biasing what is going to be allowed to be funded or not.
Mhm. Do you think that there's much of a difference between funding that comes from government sources and private sources, foundations and that kind of thing? Do you think one is a bit more resistant to fads than the other?
I think that the government funding susceptibility to fadism is probably largely driven by the strength of the uh, single individuals or small groups within the government. So if it's dispersed, if it's a dispersed system, then there's much less of a tendency to change. But if there are charismatic leaders who are brought in, particularly if the organization feels its need for strategy readjustment or something, then boy, then it'll flip in a heartbeat. And that was true in the World Bank over this integrated conservation development program.
Hmm.
And I've seen, even in an organization like the Global Environment Facility, if you have the right people in the right place, they can turn on a dime and move towards something else.
What about right now? Is there anything fads, or feel free to go to buzzword territory as well, but are there any fads that are going on at the moment which you have kind of identified as fads that are perhaps replacing something, reinventing the wheel, or that there's some other reason to be cautious of?
Yeah, so that's not a question, that's a set of questions. And all of them beg the question of sampling and whether or not you can identify a fad with certainty while it's going on.
Hmm.
Because if it persists, I don't know, you'd have to pick a number, say a decade. If it persists longer than a decade, and then transmutes into something else that's similar, then you're probably not going to say it's a fad. So it's going to be a shorter duration. There is an, I will get to your question, but there's another dimension that I wanted to introduce. Over the last 10 years, I have been very involved in the intersection between the field of synthetic biology, which is generally speaking, precision alteration of genomes by humans to achieve human desired outcomes. The intersection between synthetic biology and conservation. And that has taken me into this world of synthetic biology and its application in agriculture and food and human medicine, because conservation is only ever and always going to be a small part of this field. And there is a literature which is super interesting, which uses the term an economy of promises. Because in order to raise money in the tech world, you need to promise things. You have a product, it hasn't been fully developed, it hasn't been deployed. And so you are raising money based on the promise of what your technology is going to achieve. And that promise stops becoming associated with performance and starts moving out into the world to be supported or objected to, um, and is often still being argued about long after the technology has been proven not to work.
Hmm.
And so you have this kind of spirits of technologies that have been loosed on the land. Their corporeal being is dead, and they're still haunting the world because people are still arguing. Well, and I think, for example, the recreation of a woolly mammoth is exactly one of those things that it's not going to happen. But the argument about whether there should or shouldn't be a mammoth has actually separated itself from whether there is going to be a woolly mammoth recreated. And I think that's less true in conservation, but still think we have, particularly amplified through social media. Um, I'm sure not your podcast, but through other less responsible means. You have this whole miasma of promises and arguments about things that are not either going to happen or are not happening in the way in which the argument about them takes place. And so I don't know how the very concept of buzzwords and fads applies in this changed world in which you have this economy of promises and threats. And you have no better place to look than the reaction to the potential to modify the genomes of wild organisms in order to try to save them. So I have this huge argument about whether it's good, whether it's bad, whether you should, whether you shouldn't. This effort that I led for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, 5 years of work, developed a policy, voted on by the membership, voted down. Voted down not because anybody understood it, in my opinion, but because there was a very strongly launched anti-campaign. So the policy which said we ought to be careful about it was defeated by people who said you shouldn't even think about it.
Hmm.
So you asked me whether or not I can spot fads coming. And what I see is this very rapid cycling going on right now of people promising things and then it being argued about, and then sometimes those disappear, and sometimes they are like eddies in a pond. They start changing into a different shape and moving out across the implementation lake, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
So I can tell you about not things that I know are fads, but things that worry me. I think nature's contributions to people is one of those. And why do I think that? I think that because it is saying that we are valuing nature only in the ways that it contributes to people. So it places humankind in the middle of deciding what's got value, what contributes, and therefore what has value. And the authors of this try to avoid this by saying, no, existence value is a contribution to people, but I think that's a specious argument. And so it's a tiny little digression from me, but I have the liberty to do that.
Sure.
Because the synthetic biology, as it emerges, it's going to find ways to allow the contributions that humans value from nature to be delivered in ways that don't require the natural world.
Mm.
And then the people who have placed all of their moral arguments in the basket of nature's contributions are going to be losing nature, but getting nature's contributions, but without nature.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be a highly engineered and highly problematic world as far as I'm concerned. So
there was a similar argument made in a paper by Macaulay, I think in 2000, like early 2000 in Nature or Science, one of the big journals. And he listed a few reasons why the ecosystem services concept, so this is long before nature's contributions to people came onto the scene. But he made that was one of his main arguments was, your argument can fall flat if in future these services that you consider so important no longer require nature. They can be basically human manufactured. It's interesting though that you say, as I was going to ask you about nature's contributions to people in particular, and maybe just a very quick word to explain to those who aren't familiar with this. Both ecosystem services and nature's contributions to people are ways of conceptualizing what nature does for people. So you did actually pretty much mention that in various different categories. And the ecosystem services concept was around for a couple of decades. And then when IPBES, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, came along, they introduced this new concept, nature's contributions to people, which is very similar to ecosystem services, but they argue that it's fundamentally different. That's another discussion. My main concern about that concept, and I agree with what you said, I completely understand that, but my concern with it is more that when you introduce these new concepts, and I'm thinking about it from a particularly a policymaker's point of view, if you want to influence policymakers and you keep on changing the jargon from time to time, it's really difficult for them to keep up. And also just touching on something you said just now, they will very seldom look past the the title, look past the packaging. So something like nature's contributions to people, they'll have, just based on those few words, they'll have a particular concept of what that means. And the same thing for ecosystem services. But, we're talking as conservationists who dig quite deeply into these topics. Policymakers don't have the luxury to do that. And sometimes they don't have the expertise either, which I think makes all this even more sensitive or fragile, I guess. What do you think about this nature positive concept? And again, maybe more of a buzzword than a fad. Well, we'll see. Time will tell. But are you familiar with that?
Oh yeah.
Just my quick opinion is that, although again, I think that there's nothing new about it. That said, I think that it's probably the best way of packaging the concept that I've come across so far. So it seems to be an improvement on past ways of packaging. But any thoughts on that particular one?
Sure. It's only an improvement because the offset view of the world took over. So in the offset view of the world, if I were going to do harm here of quantity X, then I would have to make sure that quantity X was saved somewhere else. So in the end, it's a net zero. And so the nature positive people came along and said, oh my God, it really should be net positive. So, oh, we need to call this thing nature positive. Well, the entire protected area movement over the centuries has been about nature positive. I mean, so it is. So nature positive to me is probably the definition of a buzzword as far as I'm concerned.
Hmm.
It's entirely divorced from the larger context in which conservation, the modern versions of conservation, have taken place, since the 1950s, let's say. But it's been captured by organizations like IUCN, and the business community likes it because it's got a positive sign on it. But what they're wanting to do is what we've been trying to do since forever.
Yeah.
So what are you bringing to the table why don't you just give us the money to fund what we're trying to do and it'll all be better? But no, 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 no. It's got to have its own websites and its own consultancies, which then offer the services to guarantee that whatever you choose to do is going to be nature positive, et cetera, and off it goes.
Hmm. So what does that mean in practice? Does that mean that those who, these kind of very savvy, big conservation organizations who, attend all the CBD COPs and that kind of thing and know which words to use in which circumstances, does that mean that they just have sort of an unfair advantage over maybe some of the more grassroots and sometimes more effective on the ground organizations?
Well, they always do. I mean, and that's the objection, and there's a very good reason for that. And um, I've been involved with some of those large conservation organizations for a long time, and they're aware of it. And I think increasingly are trying to move money without taking much overhead directly towards more locally based organizations. But you can't take all the rangeland trusts of Tanzania and Kenya and send them with representatives who know how to effect change at the World Conservation Congress.
Hmm. Something also just that struck me while we were talking is, the examples that you gave at the beginning are perhaps more, especially I was thinking especially about the Ben and Jerry's rainforest ice cream example, is quite specific and, in its focus and even its geography. Whereas the ones that I've been thinking about are much broader. They're really kind of abstract, nature positive, nature's contributions to people, this kind of thing. They're kind of out there in the ether, and they can be interpreted in different ways, right?
Sure. Sure. No, that's a good point, and I'm glad you raised that. It reminded me, it was one of the things I wanted to say, that it's not that something that ends up being called a fad is bad. What it likely means is that in one place at one time, that works really well. It worked really well. And it may work well in the future in that place. So that place, but a new time. The problem with the fads is that it picks up that idea and says, anywhere, anytime, for anybody, this is the answer.
Hmm.
So it's not that they're bad, it's that they're unrooted and they become invasive ideas, which like all invasive species, are fine at home. It's the fact they're no longer at home that's the problem with them. And so it may be that nature positive as a concept is the perfect solution in lowland Bolivia in the savannas. Perfect. Then let it live there and let it be tested in the Tibetan highlands. But to say that everywhere at all time, nature positive is the way to do it is what turns it into a fad, and that's what makes it dangerous. So I would want to stress that you don't, if your practitioner is looking at a menu of fads, you don't close the menu and say, I'm out of here. I don't want to eat here. You say, wow, I wonder which one of these would work where I care and where I act and with the people who I need to work with to do that and test them. Now,
Mhm.
finding the money to get somebody to do that is hard, but in an ideal way, that's what I would want to see happen. I think the conservation community has almost been baked in with a backwards looking perspective that we have a tendency to want things that were true in the past. We want to return the present to the past, and we tend not to be at all alert to significant changes in the future until they have already become baked into the rest of society, and then we have to live with whatever their consequences. And I can't tell you the number of times people have said to me, why didn't anybody tell me about that? Well, the answer is you need to turn around and look forward and rather than looking backwards. And so I think that thinking about asking the conservation community to be looking forward and to be looking at these new ideas and then a critical appraisal of whether, as we just discussed, whether they're appropriate to me and my place and my people, and not wait until the funders have picked them up and then you're obliged to respond to the funders, whether or not you think that's something you ought to be doing or not.
Mhm. And I guess synthetic biology, that seems like one of those things, right? It's something which is changing fast. And if we don't take notice of that, we're just going to get left behind, really.
Well, that's exactly right. And an example more familiar to people would be the biofuels rise.
Mm,
All of a sudden, biofuels became important, and all this land was being converted into corn and what have you to grow biofuels. And the conservation community did not know what had just happened.
mm.
They could have if they'd been watching it.
They also didn't know whether they should support it or oppose it, right? I think.
Well, exactly. That's the point. But by the time they said mostly we don't support it, all the subsidies had been put into place and baked in, and they didn't have any say on it.
Mhm.
And once again, we got left like the 2-year-old at the party to sit in the corner and scream it while the adults went and drank themselves silly.
I was thinking about this today, funnily enough, just this way that conservationists, and I've been guilty of it myself in the past, the way conservationists tend to just see the world in a very isolated kind of way. And I'm not quite sure what the solution to that is. Maybe this is too big a question to answer in 2 minutes. But like, what do you think the solution is to that broader issue of conservationists, not really kind of seeing the wood for the trees, I guess you could say.
Mhm. To me, the pathology of conservation is urgent over important.
Hmm.
So, I have a colleague who has spent decades of his life trying to save Amur tigers, gorgeous tigers in the Russian Far East. And I had him over to spend the night and talk to him about synthetic biology. And he stopped me when I was barely getting started and asked me, is what you're trying to teach me going to help me save tigers next year? And the answer was no, it won't. And so he said, well, let's talk about something else. And yet, synthetic biology is going to eat him for lunch if it goes in certain kinds of ways. And then he'll end up saying, how come nobody told me about it?
Hmm.
Because he doesn't, in this case, Dale didn't have the time to learn about it and think about it ahead of time because he's got to deal with that. And so that I don't know how we solve that, but I think that's our pathology, social pathology right now. And that's why always looking backwards because we don't have time to turn around and look forwards.
Next time, I'll be talking to Marine Albakidze, who is a researcher from and now based back in Ukraine, and who works on sustainable landscape management, forest governance, and the socio-ecological systems approach to environmental conservation. The topic of that discussion is going to be how and why conservation continues in a place like Ukraine at a time like this. The war in Ukraine continues as I speak and as this recording was put together. And yet, as you'll hear, there's still a lot going on in conservation, not just despite the war, but even because of it. Please join us for that.